Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So this is Tbilisi right now. Protests are continuing against the foreign agents bill that's proposed by the parliament. The protesters are saying the president of Georgia, who is from the very pro-American party, is saying, and the American government is saying, that this bill is a Kremlin-inspired bill, a pro-Russian bill organized by Russia. And that, of course, the protesters are the, activists for democracy. Now, there's no evidence, as far as I know, there's no evidence that this bill was inspired by the Kremlin or organized by Moscow, or that it is pro-Russian in any way. But we do know for sure that the protesters are funded by the United States, are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. One of the leading organizations in the protest is an organization called SHAME, which is an LGBT organization that receives money from the National Endowment for Democracy. So we can say conclusively and without question that the protesters are American-backed. The protesters are American-funded. We can't say that the parliamentarians who proposed this bill are Russian-funded or Russian-backed or back Russia. That's complete conjecture without evidence. But stating that the protesters are being backed by America is a fact. It's a financial fact. Now, I have to say, I don't really see why it should be a problem that any country doesn't like the idea of NGOs in their country whose business it is to complain about the situation in their country, to criticize the government, monitor so-called human rights, and who are politically active in that country. I don't see why any country would want their NGOs to be financed by another country who has their own agenda and their own interests. Why would you want that? Now, I understand that NGOs are in a constant struggle for funding. Once you create and establish an NGO, you almost cannot pursue the purpose for which you created that NGO because you're busy the entire time trying to get funding. So I understand why an NGO would want to get foreign funding and why they would extend their hands out to the National Endowment for Democracy and get some money from them. But I fully understand why any government would be opposed to that, because these are people whose paymasters have an agenda, have a political agenda, have a geopolitical agenda, have an economic agenda towards your country, who are funding organizations inside your country to create controversy, to create disruption, to create opposition against your government. I don't know who would actually tolerate that. I mean, the United States and Europe banned RT, the Russian news outlet, because they didn't want them spreading so-called misinformation inside of Europe, inside the West. They don't tolerate organizations that are foreign funded, operating within their borders. I'm not sure why another country should tolerate organizations operating within their borders that are funded by foreigners. I don't see why. But I'm only bringing this up just to highlight what's happening. I don't particularly care what happens in Georgia. It's just to show the modus operandi of the United States and of the West, that they have American agents operating in Georgia, and they are deflecting from that fact by saying that the lawmakers in Georgia are Russian agents. So they're manufacturing Russian agents in Georgia. The same way that they've manufactured Muslim extremists where they don't exist, because for the last 20 years they were at war with radical Islamic extremism, right? Well, the Muslim world doesn't produce enough radical Islamic extremists to satisfy the needs of that war. So they had to fabricate and manufacture extremists where they don't exist. in Georgia, they're manufacturing Russian agents where they don't exist for the purpose of disruption, for the purpose of destabilizing the government and establishing their full and total control. This is a pattern that we will probably see repeated in other countries, where anyone who is not entirely compliant with the American position with regards to Russia, anyone who's not completely compliant and who doesn't capitulate completely with that narrative is a Russian agent. It's again, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. You're either with us or you're with the Russians. They will apply that, and they are already applying that to a certain extent with any of the countries that are remaining non-aligned, that are continuing to have relations with Russia, that are continuing to have economic and trade and diplomatic ties with Russia, and who are refusing to take sides in the Ukraine issue, except insofar as saying war is bad and an invasion of another country is bad, and their solution of the non-aligned countries is, well, the solution is peace. Peace negotiations. You need to settle this, like any war. Not send more weapons. Not escalate the war. We believe in ending war through peace. You believe in ending war through escalation and expansion. Because, of course, America would like to see this war expand. Like I've said many times, there will be spillover conflicts. There will be spillover conflicts militarily, and there will be spillover conflicts in terms of militancy and militant organizations and militant groups that you will start to see across Europe. That will be getting funding, and that will be getting a lot of the weapons that the United States demanded would not be tracked. Weapons from the United States, weapons from their allies going into Ukraine. They demanded that those weapons should not be monitored and tracked to see where they end up. So they could be ending up anywhere, and they will undoubtedly end up in the hands of militants who are organized by the United States across Europe. It's the modus operandi of the United States. It's the modus operandi of Western intelligence organizations when they want disruption, when they want destabilization. The Ukraine conflict, as I've said all along, is a destabilization project for undermining and subjugating the continent of Europe. So we have to be aware of the way they operate, what they do, and how they do it, for us to be able to recognize when it's happening in our own countries. The National Endowment for Democracy funds organizations throughout the world, throughout the Muslim world. And that essentially is the United States, the CIA, funding organizations that they can then activate as radical opposition groups for destabilization in the Muslim world. So we have to be aware of this, and we have to watch out for this. And the fact that the United States is taking this position of either you have to capitulate completely to our narrative or you're pro-Russian. And if you're pro-Russian, then you are potentially eligible for sanctions, because they've already said, the United States has already said that they will consider hitting with sanctions any entities, any individuals, any institutions in Georgia that have been involved in cracking down on protesters. So they're going to sanction Georgian officials, Georgian authorities, doing their job to establish order and tranquility in the streets of Tbilisi, while they are funding and giving money to the people who are disturbing the peace and who are protesting against the government, because they don't want the government to not allow them to continue funding and organizing and activating these very groups. Subhanallah. Jazakum Allahu khairan wa assalamu alaikum.